So the purpose of this is to show you how to diagnose problems with the C.I.S fuel system. So a little bit of background, this is an engine that we just built. It is a 2.7 liter engine, and we started it for the first time yesterday. Now, when you do a first startup, often you're fighting a lot of things, so we didn't want to get too bogged down with the fuel injection system. What we have done so far is engine is a complete rebuild from the case out. New pistons, cylinders, heads, everything's been machined. The fuel injection system, we've gone through, resealed it, though we haven't had any work done on the warm-up regulator or the fuel distributor. We've set up the C.I.S sensor plate, our throttle bodies, vacuum lines, and we've also tested our auxiliary air slide. Now, the problems that we had once we got this engine up and running were fourfold. So, those problems were a high idle. We had a rough idle as well with a partial misfire, popping in the exhaust, and then finally when I tried to lean the fuel mixtures out, the engine running would get worse. So what I did first, because as I said, it is a new engine, but just because it's new doesn't mean anything's right. I identified where our cylinder was on the misfire by cracking our bolts on the fuel distributor.
When they working. No change on that cylinder.
If you crack each one at a time, it will drop that cylinder because it drops the pressure to the fuel injector. So we located cylinder number 2 as a problem. We went through the basic diagnostics setup, which is check leak down for engine mechanical first. Leak down pressures were great. They came in at around 6% leakage, which is great for a brand new engine that hasn't even been bedded in yet. Then the next thing I checked was the ignition side of things. Once again, new ignition cables, new cap, new rotor, that doesn't mean anything until it's been verified. Check the resistance on the plug connectors, check to make sure the wire was plugged in and everything was hooked up correctly, which it was. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through, show you how we're going to chase down the problems and see if we can identify what's causing each problem one by one. So the very basis of the C.I.S fuel injection system is pressures. And to check our pressures, we need our pressure gauge installed, but we also need to, when you're in the car, run the ignition. Now, on my engine test stand, I have my fuel pump and my ignition system isolated, so I can run just fuel pump or just ignition if I want to. But I want to show you how I would start testing this system as if it was in the car. So, the first thing that I want to do is have my engine cold, so let the car sit overnight. Then I want to come to my warm-up regulator first. And this is our bimetallic strip heater. I want to go ahead and make sure this is unplugged. Now the next thing I also want to do is I want to come over to my auxiliary air slide, which is right here. Because when you turn the ignition on, this is going to begin heating. And we also had a high idle, so I want to make sure that this component is getting the right power and ground signals. We tested this on the bench. We know it's working correctly. So now we've got to check to make sure that it's getting the right power signals. So these can be a little bit difficult to get out. I've unplugged it and I'm just going to pull it forward. Now, since I've got these unplugged, I'm going to take the opportunity to test to make sure I've got good power and ground at this plug. There's two ways you can do this. You can use a voltmeter, go across these two terminals, and that'll show you whether or not you have a power and a ground. Or I'm using a little fuel injection tester. This is a standard Bosch LED. Plugs in like that. I'm just going to flick my ignition switch on and it lights up. So I know I've got power and ground at my warm-up regulator. So I'm going to take this over to my auxiliary air slide next and do the same thing. And then once I plug this in, we can see instantly that we have nothing there. Now I can also feel that the plug, something's going on, and when I look into the plug I can see somebody's pushed the terminals out. So I'm going to have to pop this apart, see where the wires are. I can feel the wires in the boot, so something's gone on here where maybe somebody stretched this connection, they've broken the terminals and they've come undone. That will cause our auxiliary air slide to stay open, which will also cause our high idle complaint when the engine gets hot. So just doing that little quick check there, we've already identified one of our possible problems. So I just popped the plug off, and it looks like our terminals have popped out. Possibly somebody trying to yank on this because it's kind of tight in there. There's not a lot of room to work. And the wire stayed still and the terminals came out. So I'm just going to see if I can find the locking tabs, bend them up a little bit, reinsert, and see if we can get this side working. Okay, I got them to clip back in. I can see the plugs right here. Grab our little test light and check to make sure we got power and ground here. I'm just going to plug in our little Noid light. And now we've got power at our auxiliary air slide. So this should now power our auxiliary air slide, which will cause the opening to close off the auxiliary air on cold running and should solve our high idle issue. Before we start testing our fuel system, we want to identify the warm-up regulator. What we're looking for on our warm-up regulator is the Bosch number. Let me just pull this off of here to make it easier to see. The number is stamped or cast into the warm-up regulator. The first number, the 0438140, represents a warm-up regulator. The number that we are interested in is the 033. This is going to be the model number of this warm-up regulator. This can be used on several different engines, and there is also often 2 or possibly 3 different warm-up regulators based on supersessions. But we need to know what this number is so we can compare it with our graphs. This is the fuel pressure gauge tester that we use. This has a lot of different adapters that will do different vehicles, different hose kits, 2 different pressure gauges. This is our pressure gauge that we will be using. These systems run approximately a 70 to 75 psi fuel system, or 5 to 5.5 bar. So you need to make sure the gauge is going to go up to at least those. Generally I want to be using this top part of the gauge. It also comes with another lighter gauge and a bunch of different connectors. So we're going to connect our fuel pressure gauge in between our fuel distributor and our warm-up regulator. Now you can connect at either end, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go in right here at my fuel distributor. So I'm just going to crack the top line here. You want to make sure if the car's been run that it's been able to sit for a couple of hours so it cools down. Also want to be careful when you unscrew it that there's no residual fuel pressure. It might spray, in which case cover it with a shop towel. So I'm just going to unscrew this line. So I'm going to attach an adapter fitting into our warm-up regulator line, and then we'll grab a wrench and tighten this down in a second, and then I'm going to pull this adapter out so I can slide my long adapter in to the top of the fuel head. So when I connect my fuel pressure gauge connection right here, I'm going to tee off to my actual pressure gauge. You want to make sure that you have a tap, and the placement of this valve is very important, because to be able to check system pressure and control pressure, we need to be able to shut this off to check system pressure and then open it to check control pressure. So when I plug this in, the pressure test port needs to be closest to the actual fuel distributor, and then the warm-up regulator side is going to be on the shut-off valve side. If you reverse this setup, when you shut this off to check system pressure, it will actually only show you whatever control pressure you have. So that's one tip you got to kind of watch. So before I get started, I've spilt some fuel in this area. I'm just going to take my compressed air and blow that fuel away. It'll evaporate pretty quick. Now we want to make sure when we're testing we don't have any fuel leak from any of our adapters, so I need to eliminate any issues of fuel right there. Throughout the entire test on a warm-up regulator, you need to make sure that the electrical connector is disconnected. Otherwise, it'll be changing our fuel pressure. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Raytec temperature gun, and I need to get an accurate measurement of what the actual warm-up regulator measures. And I've set it to degrees C, just because all of the Porsche information is in degrees Celsius. So right now it's 17.8, so I'm going to call it 18 degrees C, which should be your ambient air temperature. But it's very important that we need to know exactly what it is, because we're going to compare it to our tech information that has a graph to where the fuel pressure should be. So next I've gone to our shop manual, and just to show you, each different warm-up regulator number has a different graph. So this is why it's important that we identify which one we're working with. So on this one, we are on a 76 2.7 liter engine, so I'm covering 76 and 77 models. It'll give the factory Porsche numbers here, followed by the Bosch service numbers. So the number we're looking for is 0438140003, so that's our warm-up regulator. We have taken our temperature using a Raytec temperature gun at 18 degrees. So if we come to our graph, follow it up, it's going to show on the low side and high side. So there's a pressure range that we can be in. On the low side, we are looking at about 1.6 bar. On the high side, we are looking at around 2.1 bar. So we're going to run our fuel pressure test first and see what our warm-up regulator comes in at. So I'm just going to run my fuel pump, let our pressure build, and right now we are running at about 1.3 to maybe 1.35 bar. So we're actually running on the rich side for our warm-up regulator cold for the temperature that it should be. So the lower the control pressure, the richer the engine will be. The control pressure is working on top of our piston on our fuel distributor. So the amount of pressure in this line dictates how much that sensor plate will lift and how much fuel will actually be injected into the engine. So when the number is really high on our warm-up cycle, that will create a lean misfire or a lean engine. If the number is really low, it will create a richer running engine. So these are calibrated numbers. There are some small adjustments that can be made, but I don't recommend it. We can usually lower pressure by dropping this center pin, but usually it's better just to have this unit repaired. Next thing I want to check is my overall system pressure. So to do that, I'm just going to close the valve. My system pressure is coming in at just under, it's about 5.3 bar, and we'll check it against the spec, but that sounds about where it should be. And I'll open this, it should drop straight back down to my control pressure, 1.3 bar. The next thing that we want to do is we want to check to make sure that the hot running pressures are within range. Even though we know the cold pressures are not in range, it's on the rich side. And you may also make a decision if the car starts and runs well, if the hot pressures are all good, then you may leave it that way. So to check our hot side, I'm going to take my power connection and I'm going to plug it back into my warm-up regulator. So we're going to be electrically heating the bimetallic strip in there. That's going to cause an arm inside our warm-up regulator to change how much pressure it puts on this crossover bridge right here, and we should be able to see our pressure climb. Now this is going to take around 180 to 240 seconds to get up to its full temperature. So anywhere from 3 to 4 minutes, and we should see our temperature rise. So I'm going to run my pumps, and I'm also going to have my ignition on, and we're just going to watch that pressure gauge and make sure that it climbs. I also took a quick look at the clock just so I can get an idea on how fast it climbs up. So that's 30 seconds so far, and we can see that our pressure has already climbed to around 2 bar and is still climbing. So that's a minute and our pressure is at 2.5 bar and still climbing. Minute and a half, we're at 3 bar. Two minutes at 3.5. Okay, looks like it's stabilized at 3.5 bar or 50 psi. We've been 2.5 minutes, so we're pretty much right there, coming up to the 3-minute mark right now. We're going to leave it connected and just make sure it doesn't climb any further, but it looks like it's pretty well stabilized. That's 3 minutes. So testing without vacuum, we should be no vacuum, 2.7 to 3.1 bar. So the warm-up regulator is actually a little bit higher. It's coming in at 3.4 bar, 3.5 bar, so it's about 0.4 of a bar too high. That will make it a little bit leaner in that range. So what we're looking at here is what's called rest pressure. And rest pressure is when we shut our fuel pumps off and the system should maintain pressure and a certain amount of pressure for a certain amount of time without completely dropping all by the wayside. Now this is measuring a couple of things. It's measuring the check valve or the pressure control valve in the back of the fuel distributor. It's also measuring the warm-up regulator. There's usually an accumulator and a check valve in the fuel pump. Now on our test stand here we are not running an accumulator just because we aren't. Normally it would be mounted right in front of the fuel filter, or we're just bringing it straight from our pump. So what we're measuring here is the check valve in our fuel pump, which is holding nicely, and the pressure control valve in the fuel distributor, which is also holding nicely. And what we want to be looking for is minimum 1.3 bar after 10 minutes, and then after 20 minutes, minimum pressure of 1.1 bar. What this problem will be, if you notice, if your gauge drops all the way down to 0 as soon as you shut the fuel pumps off, it will create a hard start hot, a long crank, because it will allow the fuel system to completely drain out. When the engine is hot, it will boil off the fuel in the fuel lines, and you'll have to extinguish all of that with fresh fuel when you crank. So that's a problem that would be created by a fast leak down. So I've just took a glance at the clock right now. It's approximately 8 minutes after the hour. So we'll let this sit for 20 minutes and see what our pressures are. Sitting at 10 minutes and we're sitting exactly at 1.3 bar. So far everything's working well. The next things that we need to do is we need to check our pressures under vacuum. So we're going to do a vacuum test and then a high idle speed vacuum test. Now we're going to simulate the engine vacuum by using our vacuum pump, because we're not going to run the engine. You can do it either way. If you don't have a vacuum pump, you can connect everything up and run your engine and get these same results. So we've got two vacuum tests to perform. We have our ported manifold vacuum on the top, and this one is designed to increase control pressure. It should increase it to approximately 3.4 to 3.8 bar. And this is to lean out the engine at high speed running, where we're not under load so much, we've just got a lot of airspeed moving through our throttle housing. So I'm just going to simulate it with my vacuum pump, and as I start to pull it up, you can see our pressure comes up to about 4.5 bar. And our vacuum gauge is also not holding vacuum. It's slowly bleeding off. So that means the diaphragm inside here is not holding. And then as the pressure bleeds off, you can see as our vacuum bleeds off, you can see our pressure slowly dropping. Then our fitting down here is an enrichment fitting. So when I give a manifold vacuum signal to here, it should decrease our control pressure, and it's actually making zero change to the warm-up regulator. It is holding vacuum though, so the diaphragm's good. It's just, it's probably gummed up or frozen up in there, so it's not moving correctly. So our warm-up regulator is out of spec in pretty much all facets of operation, so it needs to be rebuilt. So we've gone through and done pretty much all of our preliminary pressure testing, and the one number that is out of spec that we can change is system pressure. And then we can re-look at our numbers and see what effect it had. So our system pressure should be between 4.5 to 5.2 bar with an adjusting specification of 4.7 to 4.9. What that means is if you measure the pressure and it's 4.5, then that is totally okay. You don't need to make any changes. If you measure the system pressure and it's 5.2 bar, that's also totally okay. But what they would prefer is somewhere between 4.7 and 4.9 bar. So let's look at how we would adjust our system pressure. System pressure is controlled by a pressure control valve mounted in the fuel distributor. Inside here is going to be a spring and a piston, and this is what controls our system pressure. To change it or to look at it, I'm just going to put a shop towel, going to undo it. Be careful that you have released all the fuel pressure. And when this comes out, it's going to have a copper seal ring, a pressure spring. There should be shims down in here. And then I'm just going to use my magnet to bring the piston out. And a piston with an O-ring. Now this O-ring on the end of this piston can also be responsible if you have poor leak down numbers. So if you switch the key off and the engine fuel pressure leaks down very quickly, if this O-ring is damaged or cracked, then it will cause your leak down pressures to fail. Now normally there would be a shim located right here in this bolt. Doesn't appear to be any in this one. I've tapped it out a few times, hit it with my magnet, and nothing's come out. So I can't remove a shim to increase my pressure, or sorry, to decrease my pressure. So what I'm going to do is, this is the original copper sealing ring. I'm just going to measure that. This one measures in at 0.73 millimeters. I've gone through our copper sealing ring assortment, and I've come up with one that's measuring 1 millimeter. So that's going to move this spring purchase back by 0.25 millimeters more than the original copper sealing ring. So it's going to go ahead, put that new sealing ring on. I want to make sure that this is completely clean. There's no debris, no heavy scoring. This needs to be able to move freely. You want to be very careful with these. You don't want to use any kind of abrasive to clean them. A very light Scotch-Brite would be about it if you do have some mild scuffing. So I'm just going to assemble the spring into my piston, grab my plug, and then put it back into the fuel distributor. So I've got my piston and my spring in, and tightened it down. So now we're going to check our system pressure and see what kind of a change it made. For system pressure, I'm just going to go ahead and shut my valve and turn my fuel pump back on. And now our system pressure is just a hair above 5 bar, so it's knocked about 0.3 of a bar off for 0.25 millimeter of change and brought it back into usable range. So now I'll plug my warm-up regulator back in, we'll heat it up and see what difference it makes on the control pressure. So we can already see that it hasn't made any difference to our control pressure. We're still hovering right at 3.4 bar. So the warm-up regulator is still going to need to be readjusted. So the next thing that we want to do is flow test our injectors and our fuel distributor. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use some graduated cylinders, and I've just got numbers on these. I use plastic ones, so if they get dropped, they don't break. These are fuel safe, and they are graduated in milliliters so that we can measure how much fuel is flowing on each individual cylinder. So to do this, all I'm going to do is grab my fuel injector. I'm going to pop it up with number 1, and I'm just going to drop it in our graduated cylinder. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. Next thing that I have to do, because the engine's not going to be running, because our fuel injectors are in our graduated cylinders, I need to lift the sensor plate. And the sensor plate, if we look down underneath, it has a little arm that pops down. And so to do that, I take a socket and I just slide that in so it lifts the sensor plate. Now, all this is going to do is inject a certain amount of fuel. We also don't care whether the engine's hot or cold when we do this test, because we're comparing the flow volumes of each cylinder, both the injector and the fuel distributor, to each other. We're not doing an actual volume test where we're looking for a set amount of fuel in a certain time. So what I want to do now is I'm just going to turn my fuel pump on, and I should have fuel flowing. And as far as in a volume amount, I just want to put enough into the cylinders, maybe 40, 50 cc's, just so I can compare each one and see if there's any differences between each cylinder. We can also take a look at our spray pattern as well if we want, because we can have an opportunity to see the injector actually spraying fuel. So I'm just going to turn it off now. I got enough in there to make some comparisons. Let's bring this one up to 50. And now all I'm going to do is line these up on my bench and see how they compare up. So when we look at how much fuel is delivered from cylinder to cylinder, the biggest difference we see is actually in cylinder number 1. So there's the number 1 cylinder. And if you're wondering what this color is, I add a little bit of 2-stroke oil to the fuel. It makes it a little bit easier to see, and also lubricates. So on cylinder number 1, I've got 45 cc's, and then across the rest of the board, actually 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are not bad. They're within a couple of cc's either side. Number 2 is 51 cc's, number 3 at 50 cc's, number 4, 49, number 5, 52, and number 6, 51. Now, we were having a problem with number 2 cylinder when we were running the engine, and looking at this, our problem, if anything, should have been on cylinder number 1. Now, it is possible that we were supporting cylinder 1 with other cylinders and it's influencing it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and run this engine a little bit more, see if we still have the same misfire. Now, to confirm whether or not this is a fuel injector or a fuel distributor problem, what we can simply do is switch the fuel injector from cylinder 1 with whatever cylinder we want, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, and see if the problem moves to that cylinder. If the problem moves, then it's in the fuel injector and not the fuel distributor. If the problem doesn't move, then it's in the fuel distributor. So I'm just going to switch cylinder 3, the injector, with cylinder 1 and see if it changes our flow rate. So we've swapped our fuel injector, and we're going to rerun the test. The same thing. We'll go to 50 cc's on number 3 is what I was looking at when I shut it down. and we'll see if our problem has moved from cylinder 1 to cylinder 3. So we just reran the test after switching injectors from cylinder 1 to cylinder 3. So if the problem was in the injector, cylinder 3, because that was that control cylinder that we filled to 50 cc's, should have changed all of the rest of the measurements. However, cylinder 1, which is this one, is still coming up at 45 cc's, and all the rest of the cylinders are still exactly the same as they were on the first test. So what this tells us is there is a restriction in our actual fuel distributor, and that is what is causing our lower fuel delivery on that cylinder. So fuel distributor will need to be rebuilt. So I'm going to go ahead and restart my engine. We know we still have a problem with the warm-up regulator pressures and the fuel distributor, but I'm not too concerned with that right now. The biggest thing I want to test and see is if our electrical repair on the auxiliary air slide corrects our high idle situation. I also want to confirm the misfire on cylinder number 2, because our fuel distributor shows a problem on cylinder number 1, not cylinder number 2, so I want to kind of delve into that a little bit deeper. So now that we've got the engine up and running, we can see that our high idle situation has been resolved with fixing the auxiliary air slide. The start was a little bit rough, but I'm not too concerned about that, just because we need to go through and do our tuning side of things. Right now, the other thing that I noticed was once the engine had run, and we've been running for about probably 35-40 minutes now, I really wanted to get the engine up to temperature. Was that my control pressure continued to climb even when I dropped off the vacuum lines. It was well outside of spec for what it should have been. So we're going to go ahead and pull the warm-up regulator, also going to pull the fuel distributor and send it out to be recalibrated. Now I went through and redid where we were misfiring, and on the bench we showed that cylinder 1 was the low fuel delivery. And it was definitely misfiring on cylinder 1. Not sure what happened there, why I said it was cylinder 2 at first. But I'm going to pull the plug and do a leak down on that cylinder just to confirm that everything's okay in there as well. I'm just going to roll it around to TDC number 1, and number 1 and number 4 are the easiest ones to find. I can set my TDC mark and then just pop my distributor cap off and see, luckily we landed up at number 1. Our rotor's pointing at number 1 spark plug. So that's a nice easy way to know when you're on top dead center. So our adapter in. We just zeroed our leak down tester. And our leak down is actually around 3%, which is really awesome for an engine that hasn't been bedded in. So I'm going to use my handheld oscilloscope. This is one of the best tools you can have on even early cars. Everyone says an oscilloscope is for a late model vehicle. That is totally not true. This one does voltmeter as well as an oscilloscope. So right now I'm just going to set it. I've already set it to digital multimeter. If I press the button, it'll switch back to my oscilloscope. But what I want to do is select ohms. First thing I do is check my cables, and they should have continuity, which they do. And now I'm going to go grab my spark plug cable, and this should read around 1500 ohms plus or minus 10%. And we are at 1.3K, so 1.35, which is on the bottom end of the scale. Totally okay, we've got good continuity. So the wire isn't an issue, the spark plug isn't an issue, the cylinder's not an issue, but we do know our fuel distributor is an issue, being that it is about 6 to 7% down from the highest cylinder, which is enough to create a lean misfire. Now, the misfire that we had was not a total dead cylinder like a spark plug would give you, or a bad ignition wire, or no compression. It was a partial misfire, just means it wasn't running effectively. You could hear popping in the exhaust. That little pump, 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 especially when I'd lift the RPM up and hold it. And that was a cylinder that was not burning its fuel charge and was putting that into the exhaust, and it was igniting in the exhaust. So when I start this for the first time after getting my fuel distributor back, and I do want to add one caveat, I have gone ahead and done the first service on this while our fuel distributor and warm-up regulator out getting rebuilt. I pulled the upper and lower valve covers, I adjusted my valves, I did my rocker shaft torques, I did my cylinder head torques, I put a new set of upper valve covers on it because the old ones were the original magnesium and they were not sealing at all. I had a leak on both sides and it was very obvious on the gasket that it wasn't sealing. So now when I start it, I'm not going to do anything in particular, just going to kind of crank it up, warm it up, and reset my fuel mixtures, and I expect it to be running fairly well. So a couple of things to take note about. When you first start the engine after having like fuel distributor or warm-up regulator or airbox, anything to do with the intake system, it's kind of hard to judge how well it starts up. I mean, we started up no problems whatsoever. Little bit of a crank time because I had some fuel in my spark plugs. But what you want to do the first time is start the engine up, get it warm, and then you need to set your fuel mixtures. Now, this is one of the important things where you have to have an exhaust gas analyzer. Now, mine has got a couple of issues. It's an older machine. I've had it for probably 20 years, and the oxygen cell calibration is old. So my O2, my AFR, and my NOx numbers are not accurate. What I am looking at is hydrocarbons and CO. Now, CO is the amount of fuel that I'm putting into the engine. Now, previously, whenever I tried to lower the fuel mixtures down, the engine would run rough, it would misfire, we were losing a cylinder is what was happening because the fuel distributor wasn't working correctly. We weren't getting equal amounts of fuel to each cylinder. Now I was able to set it at 1.6% CO. Engine is running really nice. I was able to drop the idle speed down a little bit and get it really stabilize out nice. Now the hydrocarbon number, that is a measure of unburnt fuel in the exhaust. The higher the number, the more fuel is being pushed out and not being consumed by the engine. So we want to see that as low as we possibly can. And at a couple of points there, I was seeing literally less than 100 hydrocarbons, which is way better than most modern vehicles today, even considering this thing doesn't have any catalytic converters or smoke control devices on it. So what I'm going to do next, I want to check my hot start. So I'm going to let it sit for about 20 minutes and I should be able to press my start button and the engine should start and fire and run pretty nicely. The next step is we need to let it cool down completely. Now we've got a fan on the back of the engine that's blowing some cool air over it, but it's still going to take quite a few hours for this thing to cool down, because we need to check how it's going to start cold. Now ideally, that's the true test is going to be tomorrow morning when the engine sat overnight and is completely all at ambient temperature. But we can do a couple of tests today just to make sure everything is set, and then pick this up again tomorrow just to make sure our cold start is working correctly. Okay, so we're going to check our hot start. We've had the engine sitting for about 20 minutes now. Okay, so our engine started right up, didn't need any throttle, which it shouldn't do if all your settings are correct. And I was just able to press the start button and it pretty much cranked a couple of times and fired right up, exactly what I want it to do. So we're going to go ahead and do our decel adjustment. Now when I rev the engine, it's returning to idle a little bit too fast, so I want to slow that down. So you can see how the engine dips a little as it comes back to an idle, and that's because I'm letting the throttle plate snap closed. So our adjustment is going to be right back in here, and I've already got my lock nut loosened. I'm going to show you how we're going to adjust that. So this is our decel valve, and this lock nut here is what stops the adjustment from moving, and this little center section here that's connected to our vacuum line is the adjuster. And what I'm going to do with a 6mm wrench is I'm just going to turn this. What it's doing is changing spring pressure on this unit here, and as I adjust the spring pressure up and down, when the engine decels, we get high manifold vacuum through our vacuum pipe that pulls up this valve and allows air to bypass the throttle butterfly. So we're going to adjust that just until it comes back down to idle nicely. We want a slight bit of hang time. A little better. Okay. So this particular valve, even though we tested it on the bench and found it to be vacuum-wise operational, it is really not lifting as much as it should. So when I screw this out, this reduces the spring pressure on the diaphragm and allows our manifold vacuum to pick this up easier to open and hold open. And it's supposed to hold it open just for a little while until our manifold vacuum settles down and the spring pressure overcomes it. I've got it just about all the way unscrewed and it's better, but the valve is definitely not operating the way it should do. Now this is one of those parts where you can make a decision if you want to change it or not. The effect would be if you notice stalling when coming to a stoplight, then that's going to indicate, hey, it's really going to need to be changed. For the time being, we're going to leave this one, wait till we get our engine back into the car, drive it, see how it responds, and take a look at it. It can be changed in the car, it's not a big deal, so for right now, we're just going to keep moving forward with it. So when it comes to tuning the C.I.S system, as a mechanic, there's not a whole lot of things that you can control. Everything is pre-designed to operate in a set parameter. So when it comes down to tuning, the things that you can control and change are your idle fuel mixtures, which is done with a 3mm Allen screw straight down through the center, and very small adjustments here. You do need the gas analyzer to do it. Fuel pressures have to be correct, If your fuel pressures are not correct, then the rest of the system tune is going to be out of its calibration, and so you're not going to have any chance of making the car run well. And there's a big difference between running and running well. Idle settings is another component that we have control over. We have two adjustments. We have our decel valve right here. This is there to allow us to stop the engine from stalling when it comes back to an idle. This is our actual idle air bypass screw right here. And when I'm adjusting my idle, I'm screwing it in to reduce my idle, screwing it out to increase. It's the opposite of a carburetor. A carburetor is usually pressing on a throttle lever. This is actually allowing air to bypass around the throttle plate. And that's really about it. If you have your system pressure, your control pressure set up correctly, your sensor plate height set up correctly, and your fuel mixtures set up correctly, the system will operate as it was designed. So we've let our engine sit overnight, and the last thing I want to do is check my cold start in the morning. My hot start was good. I've removed my fuel pressure gauges. I've put the air filter on, and so let's go ahead and start it up. So that was pretty much perfect, exactly what I'm looking for. The engine came up onto a fast idle pretty much straight away. Held it for about a minute, minute and a half as the air slide heated up, and then dropped itself down to a regular idle. Didn't want to stall. Everything working exactly as it should do. Yep. Oh, the valve was off.
Oh. Oh, we had it unconnected.
Yep, I didn't turn my valves back on.
Oh, that's why it blew?
Yep.
Holy shit, we need to clean it up first.
Yep. And me.
I'll get a shot on you.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'm still recording.